Great. Hi, everyone. Happy December. We're delighted to see you all for the last of our seminars in our inaugural Climate Justice Design Fellowship. And this afternoon, we're very excited to welcome Dr. Abby Spinak for a talk entitled In Search of Energy Democracy. Abby studies energy history with a particular interest in the politics of utility ownership and the role of infrastructure in disseminating economic ideas. She looks at the history of electrification in the rural US and ties it to the evolution of 20th century American capitalism and alternative economic visions. She also teaches courses on climate and environmental justice at the Harvard Graduate School of Design. And for us, most importantly, serves as a mentor in our program. She received a PhD in urban studies and planning from MIT and has been a fellow at a number of prestigious institutions. And we're excited to hear what Abby has to say today.
Jill, thank you so much. And I see it's a pretty small group. It's December, the sun is setting and everyone's busy. So I just want to say thank you for those of you who are able to make it in person. And I prepared a pretty formal talk, but feel free to interrupt me as I'm going along. With this size group, we can just have a conversation. So really don't be shy. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen.
Perfect. Thank you.
Let's see. Actually, sorry. Let me start the slideshow first. I'm really sorry. It's been a while since I've given a talk on Zoom. So let me just try that again. Okay, so which screen are you seeing?
We're seeing your notes with the screen with the notes.
Okay.
So I think if you share the other screen now, it should work.
How is that?
Yeah, perfect.
Good. Okay.
Yeah. You're all set.
Great. And thank you for bearing with me.
Of course.
All right. Okay, well, so as Jill said, my research is largely historical. For the last several years, I've been studying the history of rural electricity systems in the United States, which are largely a legacy of New Deal era federal funding. And as a historian, I draw on archival evidence to show that energy systems have a past, which is to say that energy systems are not the inevitable outcomes of rational scientific planning, but are instead historically contingent networks that are built on local politics, specific people's dreams about the future, and hypotheses about social organization that have sometimes worked, sometimes failed, and sometimes did both in complicated ways for different users. I'm also interested in how ideas of energy and its role in society have changed over time. So today, I particularly want to focus on recent calls for energy democracy as part of a just transition away from fossil fuels. But let me start with a story. In 1983, Cora Tucker pulled into her driveway in rural Virginia to find a man running away from her house. Several rooms, including her bedroom and mattress, had been soaked with kerosene. It was a traumatic event for Tucker. Afterwards, she sought medical treatment for shock. But no one was ever arrested for the incident. We'll never be able to figure out who did it, the police told her. You should just let it go. While the arsonist may have remained elusive, however, the motive was not that hard to deduce. Tucker was a longtime community organizer in Southern Virginia, who had recently run as a write-in candidate for governor. In the 1970s, Tucker founded the community organization Citizens for a Better America, organizing her neighbors in Halifax County around a wide variety of issues related to racial inequality, labor rights, voter registration, nuclear waste disposal, and education reform. In the spring of 1983, she had connected with the Southern Regional Council's Co-op Democracy and Development Project, which aimed to elect reform candidates to the boards of directors of rural electric cooperatives across the American South. The night of the kerosene incident, Tucker had just come from the annual meeting of her electricity provider, the Mecklenburg Electric Cooperative, where as a member, she nominally had the right to vote for the board of directors. Citizens for a Better America had thrown their weight behind 3 Black candidates challenging incumbents on the co-op board, ultimately organizing several hundred co-op members to vote for the first time in this community-owned utility. The incumbent board was less than thrilled about the sudden interest of Black co-op members in exercising their democratic rights. As organizers later wrote, the mere possibility that 3 of 12 board members might be Black prompted more than 2,000 whites to turn out at an annual meeting where fewer than 70 people had attended over the past 15 years. Similar tensions played out in electric co-ops across the South in the early 1980s as the Co-op Democracy and Development Project reached out to co-op members and supported Get Out the Vote campaigns. Within a couple of years, the Southern Regional Council unfortunately ran out of money for the project, but some community members like Tucker continued to pressure their co-ops for election reform well into the 1990s. As this story indicates, and as I'm sure many of you are well aware, energy companies have long presented some of the biggest hurdles in fights for climate justice. But this story I'm starting with is not about a multinational oil corporation or a coal conglomerate. Troublingly, it is about a community-owned utility, an electric cooperative. What I'd like to talk about today is a New Deal era program called the Rural Electrification Administration, or the REA, which in the 1930s orchestrated the construction of hundreds of electric co-ops like Mecklenburg across rural America. That is to say, utility companies that are owned and managed by the communities they serve. As of 2020, these co-ops continue to serve over 42 million Americans across 48 states. Though surprisingly few Americans know about them, they've been much celebrated by academics and policymakers over the decades as a triumph of New Deal era planning that brought power to the people. And more recently, they have caught the attention of a community of activists, scholars, and designers invested in building a Green New Deal for the 21st century. So to take us briefly back to the golden days of Twitter, I like to point to this thread started by climate journalist Kate Aronoff when she first discovered electric co-ops in 2017 as an example of the enduring power of the cooperative idea in the 21st century. So linking electric co-ops to communism, Aronoff gushed here, "I'm obsessed, they're so interesting." And her friends are like, "Yes, we need to talk about electric cooperatives." But the article Aronoff eventually wrote about the REA in Dissent magazine was more critical. Like Cora Tucker and the Southern Regional Council, she found more evidence of co-ops suppressing member engagement than in supporting a just transition away from fossil fuels. And she ultimately wrote about the potential for co-op reform. My research on co-ops has been largely about navigating this disconnect between the promise of community-owned energy in this moment of climate crisis, a solution which seems to provide a path towards a more just energy future, and the complicated history of this particular network of electric co-ops in rural America. Let me take a step back and talk about that promise of community energy beyond the REA. Recently, organizations like the Climate Justice Alliance have mobilized around ideas of energy democracy as part of a just transition. They define energy democracy as transitioning not just from fossil fuels to renewables, but also who is in charge of and who reaps the benefits from our energy systems. Specifically, This definition here on the Climate Justice Alliance website targets the corporate centralized fossil fuel economy as antithetical to community and environmental health, and calls instead for community governance of energy infrastructure. On the academic side, energy scholars have likewise applied critical feminist theory to argue that, quote, public democratic ownership of energy systems is the most likely means of ensuring energy justice and sustainability. And they have called for more community ownership of renewable energy generation as a reparative politics of asset building for low-income non-homeowners. But when activists and academics are calling for public democratic ownership of energy systems, or for energy to be governed by communities, what does that mean in practice? Before I dive into the history of electric co-ops, I just want to be clear that energy democracy is a broad concept that can govern many different kinds of institutions, not just cooperatives. And there have been a wide variety of experiments with energy democracy over the last century or so, in the interest of taming the corporate centralized fossil fuel economy. So first, energy democracy could mean full public ownership in the sense of a municipal, state, or federal institution. In this case, citizens nominally would have control over energy resource use and utility practices through the political process as voters. In recent years, energy democracy has more often come to be synonymous with collective private ownership, and this is where cooperatives come in, through the model of communities pooling their resources to directly own and manage energy infrastructure. As in publicly owned utilities, in a cooperative, each member gets one vote, regardless of how much they invest or spend. The difference between co-ops and public ownership is that co-ops are not part of a city, state, or federal budget. Like any corporation, co-ops can go out of business. And in contrast to a public service, which might operate at a deficit because they provide for other public goods, co-ops must therefore at least balance their books, if not turn a healthy profit. Often co-ops are not for profit, but not always. When co-ops run a surplus, they're generally required to return this money to their members, though again, they don't always do this. In any case, what I want to make clear is that public ownership and cooperative ownership are not the same thing. There is also a world in which investor ownership could be seen as a form of democracy. In her book, When Wall Street Met Main Street, historian Julia Ott has argued that widespread stock ownership arose in the United States in the early 20th century as a way to give Americans more of an ownership stake in an increasingly industrial corporate economy, especially as other paths to ownership were being foreclosed for renters and wage laborers in the country's burgeoning cities. But such efforts to build a so-called people's capitalism by and large failed. The main problem being that shareholders can hold a controlling stake in a company. So technically owning a share of a company means you have voting power and could hold the company accountable. But in reality, one vote per share instead of one vote per shareholder means that most shareholders are excluded from corporate decision-making. There are a lot of assumptions embedded in all three models. First, that ownership is synonymous with management. And second, that voting is meaningful voice. As I will discuss more today, none of these models has historically been an automatic means of ensuring either authentic community management or voice. So what I want to do now is take you back to the REA's early experiments in energy democracy in the first New Deal, starting with a brief history of electricity development in the United States. And then I hope we can talk more about what we might learn from this long experiment in the service of planning a just transition. In some sense, calls for community ownership instead of public ownership are particular to our own historical moment. At the turn of the 20th century, fights for energy democracy were mostly over public power rather than cooperative power. Anti-monopolist activists, politicians, and reformers thought that voters should have final oversight of their utilities and that services like electricity should be managed for the public interest. The American electricity grid was designed amidst such contentious political debates over who should own public goods, how much people should be able to profit from providing them, and who had the right to access them. Networked electricity started as a predominantly for-profit industry in the late 1800s. Within the first few years of electric companies producing and selling centralized power, however, charges of political corruption and extortionist business practices began to plague the industry. Before the turn of the 20th century, there was already a thriving movement for municipal power, as indicated on this chart, a thriving movement for public power. At times, it seemed like the power industry would become fully under public control. Historians of electricity often trace these early 20th century power struggles to issues of utility financing and regulation. Power lines are expensive to build and maintain, and they're often built on speculation. Electric companies thus joined a set of other utilities, like water and railroads, that economists of the time had started to call natural monopolies, industries in which competition led to unnecessarily duplicated infrastructure and drove prices for consumers up rather than down. An obvious solution in this situation is to govern utilities as public services instead of allowing them to be sold as market commodities. And many other industrializing nations turned to this public approach to electricity provision. In the United States, however, utility executives worked with progressive reformers to come up with another solution, the idea of state regulation. And private power companies very much welcomed their new status as regulated natural monopolies, because state regulation gave them a protected service area and a guaranteed customer base. Under the benevolent oversight of state regulatory commissions, private utilities consolidated and diversified in the early 20th century. And critics subsequently took these new electric empires to task for buying out smaller companies and overvaluing their stocks, varying consumer pricing geographically to subsidize rates in areas where they still faced competition, and shielding their accounting from scrutiny by moving costs around their multi-state holdings. It should come as no surprise then that the electricity industry was one of the most vilified in the aftermath of the stock market crash of 1929. A vocal set of politicians and reformers had been deeply concerned about the power industry and its so-called watered stocks long before the Depression. Drawing from international examples of public power, these reformers proposed many alternative designs for providing electricity, almost all with a larger role for government. But their proposals by and large failed to gain traction until the 1930s. Amidst these power struggles, rural America in particular suffered. Decades after towns and cities were fully electrified, private power companies continued to deny service to rural communities. Many state regulatory commissions further suppressed rural power extension by prohibiting municipal systems from extending lines outside city limits. In the words of one rural electrification enthusiast, all electricity did for rural America prior to the 1930s was illuminate difference. Now, the 1930s have many parallels to the 2020s, one of which being that it was also a time of existential environmental threat in the form of a multi-year series of droughts and dust storms that ravaged the American West, which we now remember as the Dust Bowl. As with climate change, the Dust Bowl was at least partly anthropogenic, in the sense that intensified agriculture in the West had plowed up much of the native ground cover that had previously held topsoil in place during the arid West's cyclical periods of drought. Political discourse about the Dust Bowl was equally apocalyptic, seeing in it harbingers of America's doom as a nation. And much like green energy is often talked about today, electricity then seemed to be a solution for both environmental and economic crisis. Electrifying farms promised to bring much needed irrigation to parched land, while also giving farmers new tools of automation and efficiency, and creating new markets for electrical appliances. In 1935, President Roosevelt allocated Reconstruction funding for a new agency, the Rural Electrification Administration, which was tasked with extending power lines to the farmers who had for decades lived in the shadow of their electrified urban neighbors. Now, given the exploitative reputation of private power utilities, growing critiques of laissez-faire capitalism during the Depression years, and the potential of electricity to avert environmental catastrophe in the nation's agricultural sector, we might expect that federal intervention in the country's electricity infrastructure would have come in the form of public government-run projects. And there were a few regional ones, largely big hydropower projects like the Tennessee Valley Authority. But when it came to building electricity infrastructure on a continental scale, the idea of a nationalized power grid still couldn't find political purchase, not even in Depression-era America. The solution New Deal power advocates eventually settled on was to create a federal lending agency for rural electrification projects. The REA was organized not to build electricity infrastructure, but just to offer low-interest long-term loans for anyone else willing to do it. The REA was the brainchild of an engineer named Morris Cook. Cook had been a staunch advocate for public power programs since the 1920s, and his correspondence is full of more private anti-corporate leanings. For example, these wishes from a friend for the merriest Christmas this goddamn capitalist system permits. But out of expediency, Cook preferentially considered private utilities for REA loans. Cook imagined the REA's attractive financing terms would entice the private industry to finally start taking rural consumers seriously. After months of failed negotiation, however, in which industry representatives would not commit to electric rate limits or guarantees of service coverage, the REA started looking for other borrowers. Seemingly overnight in the fall of 1935, the REA refocused their efforts towards promoting community cooperatives as their primary loan recipients, and they began to solicit farming communities to organize and apply for loans. This is the program the REA became famous for, and which has recently attracted the attention of climate justice activists as a historical example of energy democracy. So, to return to this map for a moment, when I first learned about this co-op network, with a 21st century excitement about cooperatives as an alternative to capitalism, much like Kate Aronoff, I was very excited to discover that there was a national network of community-owned utilities governing so much of our electric infrastructure. I thought this might be a latent landscape of energy democracy embedded in an otherwise largely neoliberal American infrastructural modernity. Unfortunately, it didn't take me long to realize that America's electric co-op networks in the 21st century are not exactly paragons of democracy. Instead, they are, with a few notable exceptions, extremely conservative. And I mean this on both a political and an organizational level. Thinking about recent national elections in the United States, if I didn't tell you this was a map of community-owned electricity infrastructure, what might you automatically assume that this shaded area was representing on this map? So if you lay an electoral map over this map of electric co-op territories in the United States, this landscape of New Deal economic democracy might look pretty red. We might even question whether the majority of electric co-op members in the last couple of elections have supported candidates antagonistic to democratic process and public institutions. This is not to say that a majority Republican co-op membership couldn't function as a vibrant democracy with conservative values, but that is also not what's happening here. In recent years, electric co-ops have been sued for not returning profits to their members for decades. Others have become the target of local environmental justice movements. The National Rural Electric Cooperative Association, a lobbying organization that was originally founded to provide co-ops insurance, has become better known recently for opposing environmental legislation in Washington. In 2008, Congressman Jim Cooper from Tennessee published a scathing critique in which he argued, quote, "Too many electric co-ops have turned away from their historic role as exciting pro-consumer organizations and have instead taken on deeply troubling anti-consumer behaviors and started to act like for-profit companies." Yet even statements like this are somewhat misleading, because when you start looking at co-op records, it becomes quickly apparent that most electric co-ops were never functional democracies in practice. Now, voting and meeting attendance are only partial stories of democratic engagement, but metrics such as this invite us to ask what and whose definition of democracy is represented in a co-op with continuous membership expansion, but marginal member engagement in institutional processes of governance. As I tried to understand the political origins of the Rural Electrification Administration and why New Deal era reformers became interested in cooperatives in the first place, if this is how they were going to operate in practice, I turned to archival collections, federal records in the National Archives, the Library of Congress, the Franklin Roosevelt Presidential Library, and the unprocessed archives of individual electric co-ops and the National Rural Electric Cooperative Association. And what I have come to understand from looking at these institutional records is that in the federal imagination of the 1930s, co-ops provided a convenient compromise between public and private electricity. They were an explicitly less radical alternative to public ownership. In New Deal vernacular, they provided a middle way between state socialism and laissez-faire capitalism. As the REA came to reframe the situation, their initial negotiations with private companies failed not because rural electrification was a bad investment, but because the margins simply weren't high enough for a greedy industry. In their shift to promoting cooperatives, REA agents maintained that rural electrification was inherently profitable. They played up the idea that cooperatives were also private businesses, but even better ones because they weren't held captive to the interests of investors. The message at the heart of these arguments was that rural electrification made economic sense and was not a government handout. Rather, electrification would create a virtuous cycle of growth by stimulating demand for commercial goods in rural homes, even as it increased the efficiency of rural agricultural and industrial production to supply urban consumers. On this logic, Franklin Roosevelt at one point explained the program as a trade agreement between rural and urban America. As I mentioned earlier, we might compare and contrast this with other countries where rural electricity was publicly owned or government subsidized. For example, one of the major influences for REA designers was the Ontario Hydroelectric Power Commission, a publicly owned province-wide electricity system that by the 1930s had already been serving both urban and rural Ontarians for 20 years. Other countries with better records of rural electrification had achieved these goals through nationalizing their electricity industries and governing power delivery as a not-for-profit right of citizenship. In our contemporary context, where the privatization of basic utilities has come to seem non-exceptional, it's important to revisit these histories and to realize that the American model was one choice among many, one that limited possibilities for other electrical futures to unfold. So one way we can understand the implications of this choice is in how it impacted local communities. Who was excluded, who was included, and what rights and responsibilities did inclusion entail? In navigating the REA's particular vision of electrical modernity, nascent American co-op communities very quickly learned to emphasize their economic growth potential, speculating in their loan applications, like the one here, about future industries such as creameries and sugar factories, and discussing in detail the quality of their soil for intensified agriculture. This was necessary because the REA did not fund all co-op applications. The REA leadership made clear from the outset that they saw electrification as a way to protect fertile farmland from returning to wilderness, but that proposals for areas which have been determined as submarginal for agricultural purposes should be denied. Where poor lands should be retired from farming because the physical resources cannot support a progressive and permanent agriculture, REA publications told the nation, they saw no economic or social justification for electric power. I have thus come to talk about REA funding as a kind of rural redlining. As with contemporaneous federal insurance maps of urban neighborhoods that conflated mortgage risk with race, federal assessments of rural viability became a self-fulfilling prophecy, launching some areas into a new age of electrical modernity while condemning others to infrastructural backwaters. Of course, as in urban areas, assessments of economic viability exacerbated racial inequality under the fiction of best business practices. There was already precedent prior to the REA for field surveys to apply race as a correction factor in estimates of household consumption. Such racist conventions as systematically coding Black households as lower power consumers made it easy for co-op boards and management to discriminate against Black residents, particularly in the American South. In the late 1940s, REA field appraiser Max Colbert reported from Virginia that the discretion co-ops had been given to extend electricity based on economic potential had created a racialized infrastructural landscape. In an appendix, Colbert cautioned should not be shared with the co-op's management. He reported that certain directors do not wish attention given to progress of Negro farm members and are not interested in whatever facts of the sort might be discovered. He included statistics from a random sample of farms. The majority of electrified farms were white, while 85% of, quote, potential farm consumers were non-white. The question of tenant farmers also plagued the REA from the beginning. In 1938, the head of the REA Cooperative Education section argued to a colleague, "I do not believe the REA should permit any discrimination against sharecroppers and tenant farmers. The only fair criterion is that of the economic effect on the project itself. If a tenant can pay the membership fee and can arrange for the wiring of his property, I should consider him eligible for membership." So, unsurprisingly, for years, REA field specialists noted that tenants' houses lacked electricity. And this photo that I'm including here, on the back of it was written, "Tenant customer, Woodruff, Arkansas, does this look like $250 per month?" which was probably the minimum charge that the co-op would have required from their members. Now, we've been conditioned in the United States to hear claims of economic solvency in public programs, and particularly their ability to contribute to economic growth as signs of responsibility, rationality, and even equity. But critical scholarship on the evolution of American economic thought in recent years has shown that many of our ideas about the health of the economy and good economic practices were also creations of the mid-20th century. Historians have shown how technologies like national income accounting and gross domestic product, or GDP, were forged at the same time and by some of the same people who were envisioning a new electric modernity for the United States. Both were predicated on the idea of abundant energy fueling infinite growth, and both served the project of constructing the nation as the territory of concern, reimagining the American citizen through the identity of consumer and investor. So it's important to contextualize the profit orientation the REA imposed on co-ops as a set of context-specific social values, rather than economic common sense, and to look at their use of the co-op business model as a particular form of economic technology for a particular era. The REA growth-oriented co-op model, for example, left little room for local self-determination within the tight operating constraints that the REA loans imposed. After distributing loans, REA officials made sure that co-ops followed up on their promises of growth. Field agents would visit new co-ops regularly and often chided them on their rates. Utilization specialists showed up with free lamps and flashy kitchen demonstrations. And more importantly, the REA made sure that co-op members of at least moderate income had access to loans for wiring and plumbing, and encouraged them to buy refrigerators, electric ranges, water pumps, and washing machines on federally insured installment plans. This was a vision of electric democracy that taught users empowerment was to be found in consumption and efficiency, even as REA propaganda romanticized democratic process. Drawing on tropes of the rural statesman as the pinnacle of American citizenship, Cook and others sold the idea of rural electricity as a social liberator that would allow farming communities to transition to part-time agriculture, giving them more time to engage in their communities, talk politics with their neighbors, study, or pursue creative talents. But in practice, the REA mainly used democracy rhetoric to scold co-ops, especially farmers who refused to grant easements for electricity lines to be built across their land without compensation. This definition of democracy did not sit well with all farmers. In 1937, the American Farm Bureau issued a resolution encouraging farmers to say no to REA loans without stronger guarantees of self-governance. Farmers are entitled to have a definite voice in the development and operation of these enterprises, the resolution stated. If these projects are to be governmentally or bureaucratically controlled, they should not be organized under the guise of cooperatives. Boyd Fisher, the head of the REA development section, dismissed this criticism as irresponsible. Separating the democracy of ownership from the democracy of management, Fisher argued, we are doing things now that are dictatorial, but we've got to do it. The REA was not set up and it is not being maintained by the president and Congress for the purpose of having cooperatives. We are set up to promote rural electrification. We should adopt a cooperative method of ownership. Cooperative management is another thing. It's a different question. The cooperative management idea has to justify itself. In any case, a landscape of engaged farmers who farmed in the morning and engaged in civic activities in the afternoon was ultimately incompatible with the REA's project of sustained electrical growth. As the commodity prices of farm projects dropped with more efficient mechanized agriculture, and as already economically marginal farm families were encouraged to take on debt for wiring, plumbing, and appliances. Instead, debt-financed cooperative electrification in the 1930s was a landscape reordering project that contributed to the construction of rural industrial parks, vacation homes, and other high-powered experiments such as the Colorado ski industry. I ultimately argue that rural electric cooperatives are an important part of the history of American capitalism, specifically their important role in normalizing debt and credit as mechanisms of responsible business management and personal consumerism. Through the logic of responsibly servicing both community and personal debt, the REA taught its borrower members a version of democracy dependent on perpetual economic growth. This reorganized not just the American countryside, but the global one as well, as US aid programs funded American-style co-op electrification projects across the global South in the 1960s and 70s. As electric co-ops continued to expand over the 20th century, co-op managers connected more to professional utility and business networks than to their local communities, eventually looking beyond the REA to provide themselves new financing from private equity to build new generating plants. Co-op boards reappointed themselves year after year when annual meetings failed to meet quorum. Far from being a venue where the nation's 42 million electric co-op members can deliberate about how best to meet their community's energy needs, the New Deal legacy of energy democracy is thus one of largely unresponsive bureaucracies. Which is why most of the interesting work being done these days around American electric co-ops has come in the form of social movements to make them more accountable to their memberships. And yet, even as committed members around the country are now turning to that hard, painstaking work of figuring out how to re-democratize their co-ops, the idea of cooperative energy, and especially the rhetoric and aesthetics of this New Deal promise of energy democracy have found their way into recent climate activism. So another example, much of the design work around the Green New Deal explicitly evokes Lester Beale's iconic REA posters from the 1930s. As a scholar of the New Deal and a citizen in solidarity with climate justice, I find myself conflicted about the potential and limits of energy democracy as it has been practiced in this country. For a while now, I've come to see REA co-ops as an important case study for energy democracy activists, in that they show that community ownership does not always lead to just outcomes. When we talk about the plural energy futures that a just transition could make possible, so often we are drawing not from the United States' long experience with electric co-ops, but from traditions of activism like Cora Tucker's work in Virginia, or the Climate Justice Alliance's future visioning of a just transition. Ideas of energy democracy that have rarely become material reality in practice, rarely had the chance to reshape landscapes and livelihoods, or to forge a new compact between energy and economy. So as we think ahead towards new forms of power for a Green New Deal, we might ask, what kinds of energy systems bring new kinds of empowerment? What lessons can we learn from energy democracy experiments of the first New Deal that can strengthen the transformative reach of energy as a resource that might allow people to organize and dream together? If not energy democracy, what other frameworks do we need to design a post-carbon future that truly empowers people? This isn't a question I can fully answer, but I'll end with 3 takeaways from the cooperative energy experiments of the 1930s. First, real empowerment is not just a question of ownership, but also one of finance. We need new forms of finance and support for community projects that enable them to do more than just catch up to some uniform idea of material modernity, but rather to experiment with alternative paths of development. The REA serves as a cautionary tale for how such alternatives are easily co-opted through the technical demands that connect them to more traditional financial and business practices. Second, and relatedly, we need ways of envisioning low energy futures that also provide for public health, security, and well-being. There is nothing inherent about technologies like electricity that demand continual system growth or increased consumption. But imagining a world of sufficient energy rather than unlimited energy requires that we ask questions that have difficult answers in contemporary American society, like what conditions would make job growth possible without economic growth? And then finally, we need to think more about planning our built environments for societies that are not dependent on the continued existence of extractive mineral frontiers. We need creative forms of design for a post-carbon future that do something other than replacing oil extraction with intensifying demand for lithium and other resources that support renewable energy as growth industries. We might recall from the New Deal that the REA brought electricity to rural residents, but it did not preserve communities or places from industrial impact. Rather, it opened up more of the country for ecologically intensive land use and turned more rural places into sacrifice zones of extraction and pollution. It is also worth recalling here that electricity was promoted as the clean, modern energy of its era because it was smokeless in its final destination. But in electricity's separation of sites of production from consumption, it created new kinds of spatial inequalities. Like electricity, renewable energy technologies are already proving to be clean for some and ecologically devastating for others. In short, we are in dire need of new democratic imaginaries for a just energy future. Thank you.
Thank you, Abby. This has been amazing. And it's nice to see the whole thing, or more of the whole thing, so I'm glad you gave us this sort of more formal talk. It was really exciting to see, and also to make these sort of connections between I guess redlining and things that are more commonly thought about and the rural, but also this idea of kind of promoting consumption or this buy-in as like this literal buy-in. It reminds me of some conversations we've been having. I don't know if Carlos is still here, but around Carlos's project and holding financing accountable for racist pasts and racist futures. So it's been really great to kind of think about that. I don't have a question. I don't know if others have a question, but I just wanted to sort of say that that idea. And I guess it also thinks about degrowth, or like how you might, could you sort of promote something that is less than what we previously had, which is kind of a little bit what I think your last takeaways for us have been. Like, how do you sort of, build on that? I
Right.
don't know if you have thoughts. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, that the renewable energy can't just be a plug and play. Right, but it has to be like, if we're really talking about a just transition and forms of democracy that will help us envision that future, we need ways of envisioning energy that aren't just swapping solar panels for coal, right?
Yeah.
But asking like, how would we live differently in a low energy future, and what kinds of governance structures would be necessary both to build that, but also what are the opportunities for community engagement that would be possible in that world?
Yeah. I mean, do you have thoughts on that, on those questions of the sort of governance models? Are you still excited about cooperatives, or?
Well, I mean, one thing I'll say is that some of these, this history is pretty declensionist. It's pretty down on co-ops, but there are some co-ops around the country that are doing really exciting things. And so I'll mention two of them. Actually, I kind of made fun of Western Colorado, but to go back to that, but there's a co-op in the Roaring Fork Valley, which is where Aspen is, called the Holy Cross Energy Cooperative, that they've been really concerned about climate change taking away their snow. And so they've been really serious about mitigation efforts and not just adaptation planning. And so one thing they've been doing is investing in a lot of local generation, including projects that are pretty unsexy compared to things like wind turbines or solar farms. Like they built a plant recently at the mouth of an abandoned coal mine to harvest the methane and turn that into electricity. And it's kind of a complicated project because they're also selling renewable energy credits to California. But for me, it's very much looking at local solutions, and like seeing what resources exist within the co-op territory. And so it's kind of a bioregional alternative in a way, like a neo-bioregional alternative, maybe, which again, it's not degrowth, but it is kind of shrinking the supply chain.
Right, and closing the gap between consumption and production.
Right.
Jimmy, did you have a question?
Yeah. Hey, Abby.
Hey, Jimmy.
This was awesome. I'm sorry I missed the first portion of it, but I'm curious to hear your thoughts about the role of maybe media and marketing, and sort of it's not necessarily tied directly to these things, but I heard recently, or I read recently, how your individual carbon footprint is now the recycle your water bottle of like the present, where, hey, you can do this only if you do like this one thing. What is your kind of responsibility? If you recycle this bottle, you can save the world. But there's a lot of criticism around, like, is that really media driven by the companies who created the problem in the first place? And like the sort of geopolitics of media, and Reddit and TikTok and all these things that everyone can see in an international way. I don't know if I can really bring it down to like the person and the rural areas. And I also don't fully understand everything that you presented because it's so cool and like in depth. But yeah, maybe role of media and finance around that.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I don't have immediate references for you, but I know there's been a lot of really interesting work done recently on the role of corporations in making things like climate change seem like personal accountability. Maybe Naomi Oreskes might be a good place to start. Her work it's a little bit more broadly political, but yeah, things like recycling. I mean, you should recycle and and try not to fly all over the world, but honestly, those individual behaviors are much less important than political action. And, I think histories like this one make that very clear, that it's that the way that our infrastructure has been set up by like large scale financing programs and institutions interested in sort of compelling users of infrastructure into a particular financial future. That to me is so much a story of, I mean, it's not, I don't want to say that I don't believe that people can have like individual impact, but I just feel like the need for structural solutions is so much bigger than the need for recycling your water bottles. That I mean, so again, like I keep going back to slides that I'm like, well, I kind of made fun of this, but actually I think it's great. I think a lot of the media that is sort of evoking New Deal aesthetics to try to re-envision a just transition is really powerful. The danger of it is to sort of, it's a question of like, what parts of the New Deal are we bringing forward into the future? And I think, we shouldn't bring all of them, but media that sort of evokes a time where, I don't know, citizenship meant slightly different things and people looked to the government with a little bit more faith and trust. Not everyone, but some people, is pretty powerful. So, I mean, that's a different kind of media than I think you're talking about, but I mean, visualization is important.
Yeah, no, that was really helpful. Also, yes, recycling is important. not to drop that off on the side, but yeah, there's so much complexity in it, and I appreciate all this the context. This is the first time I'm learning about a lot of this, even though I've read some stuff. So, Abby, this was awesome.
Thank you for coming. It's great to see you.
Likewise.
Where are you geographically?
Brooklyn. I'm in New York right now. So.
Awesome.
Mm-hmm.
Cool. I think there's just one more sort of comment maybe that you want to come. Oh, there's a question from Roberto and a comment in the chat. Nice to see you, Roberto. Would you like to ask a question?
Hey, Jill. Hey, Abby. I guess the co-op logic is super interesting when I think about something that is lateral to this, which would be carbon bonds and afforestation and reforestation efforts. I'm in Mexico now, and I've seen like a lot of community grassroots efforts that have a lot of autonomy because they don't depend on financing, but they're also very limited because they don't depend on financing. So I've been thinking about how would that scale up, and thinking about the different logics that you talked about. Co-op seems to be very interesting when you frame it like you've been framing the energy ones. So it's only laterally related, but I think there's something there between carbon bonds, afforestation or reforestation, and this whole energy grid logic. I don't know if you could maybe direct me to something that could maybe click with this way of thinking.
Yeah, I want to tell you to read a thesis at the GSD. You can access them, right?
You can email us and we can help you.
Yeah, or you can email me. So I advised a student a couple of years ago who studied Massachusetts green bonds as a climate mitigation measure. I will, you know what, if you email me or email Jill to email me, I'll send you the information and I'll try to find the thesis for you. But let me think, who else is talking about this? I mean, it's a really important question. It's not specifically about climate, but there's a group at MIT, the Community Innovators Lab, that has been involved in a lot of like rethinking things like credit unions and community banking, sort of, finance for a just future.
Yeah, thank you. That's super great start. I'll follow up on that. Thank you.
The other thing, if you want more of this like very detailed pedantic history, is I just finished a chapter of the book that I'm writing around all of this research on the use of mortgage-backed securities by co-ops in the 1970s, and how they, like, why they turned to private finance and how that changed their image of themselves as co-ops. I really loved writing that chapter, and I think it's like utterly boring, but I think there's a lot of power in I don't know, boring infrastructure.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
So just a plug.
Sounds good. I think Carlos had a question around successful energy co-op models that come from community land trusts, or the relationship of collective land tenure to these to access.
That's also a great question. I know that there are a lot of different kinds of energy co-ops being built very much separate from the REA network. I can't think of any off the top of my head, but let me think. I mean, obviously tying it to land is super important. And I mean, I guess I also want to say again that not all co-ops in the REA network are conservative in the way that I criticize them for being, but all of the ones that have sort of moved into this more like community management model that are trying to think of themselves as co-ops in a political sense, especially around renewable energy investments, went through a process of community re-engagement where like members realized that they got their energy from a cooperative and started asking, what does that mean? And why am I not included in these decision-making processes, and mobilized with their neighbors to take over the boards and really reform the agenda through a contentious political process. So I guess I would say that I see potential, that one of the reasons I'm still interested in studying this network, and one of the reasons I'm interested in highlighting this history, is to think about what else they could be. Because I do think it is still this latent infrastructure of democracy. It's just been co-opted, and it needs some activism.
Awesome. I think that's the perfect sentiment to end on. So thank you so much for joining us. We loved having you. And if there are more things, I'll sort of forward them your way. But this has been great. Thank you.
Thank you, Jill. It was great to see you. And thanks to everyone for coming. Happy holidays.
Awesome. You too.